This is a compilation of over 1 hour of everything wrong with zombies in movies and shows explained, so sit back, relax, and grab your popcorn. Let's kick things off with everything wrong with Zombieland. Zombieland is one of the most beloved zombie comedies ever made, and honestly, it deserves that reputation. But it's also a movie that falls apart the second you start thinking about literally anything happening on screen. From survival rules that would get you killed to an entire power grid that shouldn't exist, today we're breaking down everything wrong with Zombieland, starting with the very first rule. Rule 1, the cardio contradiction. Columbus opens the movie with what he considers the single most important survival wisdom he's developed over 2 months of the zombie apocalypse. Rule 1, cardio. His reasoning is simple. When the virus struck, for obvious reasons, the first ones to go were the fatties. On the surface, that tracks. Being able to outrun a zombie seems like a solid strategy, but here's the thing. Cardio is only one piece of the fitness puzzle, and it's not even the most important one. Think about what you'd actually need to do daily in the zombie apocalypse. Swing a baseball bat hard enough to crack a skull. Drag furniture to barricade a door. Climb a fence with a 30-pound backpack. Wrestle free when a zombie grabs your arm. Every single one of those tasks requires muscular strength, not cardiovascular endurance. A marathon runner who can't swing a fire axe is just a guy who dies tired. Columbus had 2 full months to develop these rules, and the best he came up with for Rule 1 was be able to run far. That's like a firefighter writing a survival manual, and the first chapter is just wear comfortable shoes. Cross-training is objectively superior to pure cardio for survival. You need endurance and strength and explosive force. Any personal trainer on the planet could tell you this. Columbus apparently could not, but the film never acknowledges this gap. Every time Columbus survives an encounter, the movie frames it as validation of his rules rather than what it actually is, which is a combination of luck, Tallahassee's firepower, and the fact that these zombies have the tactical awareness of a golden retriever chasing a tennis ball. Columbus's neurotic rule-making is genuinely funny. Watching this anxious kid treat the apocalypse like a self-help seminar is great comedy, but the rules themselves wouldn't survive 5 minutes of actual scrutiny, which is, not ideal when your life depends on it. This is the pattern for the entire film. Style over substance, comedy over logic, vibes over coherence. And it only gets worse from here, because at least Rule 1 is debatable. The next problem? That one breaks the laws of physics. The infinite power grid. Let's talk about the elephant in the room that nobody seems to want to address. Pacific Playland, the entire narrative destination of this film, runs on electricity. Fully operational rides, carnival lighting, mechanical attractions spinning away like someone's been paying the electric bill. In a world where 99.9% of the human population has been turned into flesh-eating maniacs. Here's the thing. Power plants don't run themselves. They require constant human oversight, technical expertise, and round-the-clock maintenance to keep generating electricity. Substations need monitoring, transformers need servicing. Thousands of miles of transmission lines need to not be, destroyed by the apocalypse. With essentially 0 qualified humans left alive, every single link in that chain should have collapsed within days, maybe weeks if we're being generous. But no, Wichita and Little Rock show up to Pacific Playland, flip a switch, and the whole park lights up like Times Square on New Year's Eve. Carnival music blasting, rides spinning, lights blazing across the California night sky, which is, not ideal when you're trying to avoid attracting every zombie within a 10-mile radius. But we'll get to that stupidity later. The real kicker is that the filmmakers clearly knew this was a problem. Zombieland, Double Tap, the sequel released a full decade later, attempts a retroactive fix by explaining that everything runs on power from hydroelectric dams. Cool, great. Except hydroelectric dams also require ongoing technical management, preventive maintenance, component replacement, and constant monitoring to function. They don't just sit there generating free electricity forever like some kind of magical waterfall battery. And even if the dams somehow kept running on autopilot, the electrical grid connecting a distant dam to one specific amusement park in California requires maintained substations, transformers, and distribution infrastructure across hundreds or thousands of miles of zombie-infested wasteland. So the sequel's explanation doesn't fix the problem. It actually makes it worse by drawing attention to an inconsistency the filmmakers obviously recognized but couldn't solve. Hey, remember that thing that made no sense? Here's a reason that also makes no sense. Add that to the list. The truth is simple. A realistically depicted post-apocalyptic amusement park would be pitch black, mechanically dead, and slowly rotting, but that would make for a terrible movie climax. So the film chose spectacle over physics. And honestly, I respect the commitment. I just can't pretend it makes sense. But if the power grid situation bothers you, wait until you hear about Tallahassee's entire quest being built on a snack cake lie, the Twinkie expiration date. Tallahassee's entire personality can be boiled down to 2 things: killing zombies and finding Twinkies. The zombie part works. The Twinkie part does not, because the movie's emotional engine, the one quest that defines Tallahassee as more than just a guy with a cowboy hat and anger issues, is built on a factual lie. Here's the thing. Twinkies are not immortal. They never were. The cultural myth that Twinkies would survive a nuclear apocalypse is one of those facts that everyone believes and nobody has ever actually checked. Before 2012, a Twinkie lasted 7 to 10 days on a retail shelf. The absolute maximum shelf life was 26 days. That's it, 26 days. After the 2012 reformulation with stronger preservatives, they bumped that number up to a whopping 45 days, which still wouldn't matter because this movie came out in 2009. Columbus tells us directly that approximately 2 months have passed since the outbreak. That's roughly 60 days, which means every single Twinkie left in America has been expired for over a month. Tallahassee isn't searching for the last delicious snack cake on Earth. He's searching for the last piece of expired sponge cake on Earth. He's on a cross-country road trip for stale cream filling, which is, not ideal. But wait, remember the crashed Hostess truck they find? The one where individual Snowballs packages come pouring out loose like some kind of snack cake avalanche? Real delivery trucks don't work like that. Hostess products ship from the factory in boxes stacked on shelves inside the truck. Even if some panicking employee frantically loaded the thing before fleeing, they'd be throwing in boxed product. You wouldn't get a loose waterfall of individually wrapped Snowballs tumbling out the back door. I don't know what to tell you. That truck was packed by the props department, not by Hostess. And then there's the payoff. Tallahassee finally, after an entire movie of searching, gets his hands on actual Twinkies, and Columbus shoots them through a door because he thought there was a zombie behind it. The quest ends in friendly fire and destroyed snack cakes. Beautiful. But here's the kicker. The Twinkies that Woody Harrelson actually eats on camera, they're not real Twinkies. Harrelson is a strict vegan, so every Twinkie he consumed during filming was a vegan substitute. The man spent an entire movie desperately hunting for a snack that was already expired, finally got it destroyed by his own teammate, and the version he does eat on screen is a fake. The quest was doomed on every conceivable level. The food was expired, the truck was wrong, the payoff got shot, and the actor wouldn't eat the real thing anyway. Great, add that to the list. But if the Twinkie quest is built on bad science, wait until you see what happens when you actually try to count Columbus's rules. The 32 rules versus 19 rules discrepancy. This is where Columbus's whole deal starts to fall apart. His entire personality is built on one thing: obsessive, compulsive, neurotic organization. The guy has a numbered list for surviving the apocalypse. That's his identity. That's what separates him from every other scared college kid stumbling through the wasteland. So you'd think the list itself would be, organized. It's not. The film tells us Columbus has created 33 rules by the time the credits roll. Sounds impressive. Sounds thorough. Except only about 19 to 22 of those rules are ever actually shown on screen or verbally referenced. The rest just don't exist as far as the audience is concerned. They're phantom rules. Columbus apparently has an entire chunk of survival wisdom he never bothered to share with anyone, including us. But here's where it gets weird. The numbering doesn't even make sense for the rules we can see. The list jumps from Rule 10 straight to Rule 13 with zero explanation. Multiple other gaps appear throughout the system. Rules just skip numbers like Columbus was writing them down during an earthquake and lost count halfway through. Then there's Rule 17. Originally it's don't be a hero. Classic Columbus. Cautious, cowardly, practical. But after he faces his greatest fear at Pacific Playland, he revises it to be a hero, which is a nice character moment, sure, but it also means the list isn't a survival guide. It's a mood journal. He's not documenting tested principles. He's scribbling down whatever feels right in the moment and slapping a number on it. And the sequel makes it even worse. In Double Tap, Rule 26, a little sunscreen never hurt anybody, gets renumbered as Rule 36. Same rule, different number, zero explanation. The entire system apparently underwent a major revision between films that nobody acknowledged or justified. Here's the thing. A genuinely orderly mind, the exact personality type Columbus is written to embody, would not produce a 33-item list with gaps, revisions, contradictions, and phantom entries. That's not organization. That's a guy who thinks he's organized because he uses numbers. There's a difference. The comedy works because his false sense of control is funny, but the film also wants us to believe these rules literally kept him alive for 2 months. You can't have both. Either the rules are reliable survival wisdom, or they're the anxious scribbles of a kid who watched too many self-help videos before the world ended. The movie wants it both ways and never picks a lane. But if a messy list is the worst thing about Columbus's system, wait until you see what happens when the film tries to handle actual physics. The physics of the zombie kill of the week. Sister Cynthia Knickerbocker is a legend. She earned the coveted zombie kill of the week by dropping an entire piano on a zombie, which is, one way to handle that situation. Other nominees include a construction worker who flattened one with a steamroller, and a biker who used his motorcycle as a blunt instrument of divine justice. These are all presented as peak zombie elimination. The film celebrates them like Olympic highlights. And nobody seems to notice that they completely contradict everything Columbus has been preaching for the entire movie. Here's the thing. Columbus built his entire survival philosophy around efficiency. Conserve resources. Don't waste ammunition. Be precise. The double tap exists specifically because you're supposed to target the head, confirm the kill, and move on. That's the system. That's what we've been told works. But then the film introduces a competition that literally rewards the opposite approach. The zombie kill of the week isn't about precision or resource management. It's about who can waste the most energy in the most spectacular way possible. Dropping a piano on someone isn't a survival strategy. It's a Looney Tunes bit. And before you say it's just a comedy, relax. The film wants it both ways. It wants you to take Columbus's rules seriously as genuine survival wisdom, while simultaneously celebrating Tallahassee-style chaos as equally valid. Those two philosophies cannot coexist. One says, be smart, be careful, aim for the head. The other says, find the nearest steamroller and go nuts. The movie never picks a side. It just hopes you won't notice the contradiction. But here's where it gets genuinely wrong. Not tonally wrong, physically wrong. During the Pacific Playland climax, a zombie headbutts the passenger window of a Hummer and shatters it. Just smashes right through with its skull. Looks dramatic, feels dangerous. And it is completely impossible. Tempered automotive glass does not break from blunt force impact. That includes a human head. That includes a zombie head. That includes basically anything that isn't a sharply pointed object or a specific spring-loaded braking tool. This isn't a matter of opinion or interpretation. This is material science. You could slam your forehead into a car window all day and the only thing you'd break is your forehead. The glass would be fine. It might crack eventually under extreme sustained pressure, but it is not shattering on impact from a headbutt, ever. The film needed that window to break for the scene to work, so it just broke it. No explanation, no setup, no modified zombie strength justification. Just a head, some glass, and a prayer that nobody in the audience had ever watched a single episode of Mythbusters. This is the core problem with Zombieland's approach to zombie combat. The rules say one thing, the spectacle says another. And when the spectacle needs physics to cooperate, physics gets fired and replaced with whatever looks coolest. Columbus spent the whole movie telling us that careful, methodical elimination keeps you alive. The film spent the whole movie proving that careful and methodical is boring and pianos are better, but at least the kills are just inconsistent. Wait until you hear about the apartment encounter that breaks Columbus's entire backstory. The apartment 406 paradox. Columbus spent 2 months building a survival philosophy based entirely on avoiding risk. He made rules about cardio, about checking back seats, about not being a hero. He talks about this system like it's scripture. And then the film shows us his very first zombie encounter, and it completely destroys everything he just told us. Here's what happens. His neighbor from apartment 406, played by Amber Heard, shows up at his door claiming she was bitten by a homeless man. She's scared, she's confused, and she needs help. And Columbus, the guy whose entire personality is built around pathological risk aversion, just lets her in, opens the door, welcomes her into his living space. During an active zombie apocalypse where people are literally converting into flesh-eating monsters in every apartment building in America. Let me explain why this is such a problem. Columbus had 2 full months of isolation, 2 months to think about threats, develop protocols, and prepare for exactly this scenario. Someone shows up at your door during the end of the world and says they were bitten? That's not a gray area. That's the most obvious red flag in the history of red flags. Every zombie movie ever made has established that bite equals infection. Columbus, a self-described shut-in who presumably consumed enormous amounts of horror media, should know this better than anyone alive, but he lets her in anyway. And then she turns. Because of course she turns. And Columbus is forced to kill her with the lid of his toilet tank. Not a weapon he prepared. Not something from a fortified position he'd spent 2 months building. A toilet lid. He grabbed the nearest heavy object in a panic, like someone who had zero preparation for this exact situation despite having had 60 days to prepare for this exact situation. Here's where it gets worse. Columbus lived in a multi-unit apartment complex, an entire building full of people who were presumably exposed to the same virus sweeping the country. Where did they all go? Did every single resident except Columbus and 406 just vanish? The film never addresses this. He apparently survived 2 months in a building where zombies could have been lurking behind every door on every floor, and for 406 was his first and only encounter. That's not careful survival strategy. That's winning the lottery. And this is the real problem with the 406 scene. The film opens by selling us on the idea that Columbus's neurotic rule system is what kept him alive. His narration frames the rules as hard-won wisdom, lessons extracted from dangerous experience. But the very first scenario we witness tells a completely different story. Columbus didn't survive because of his rules. He survived despite breaking them. His rules are post hoc rationalizations, not genuine strategy. He's a guy who got lucky exactly once, then wrote down a bunch of guidelines and pretended they were the reason he was still breathing. The film accidentally reveals its own hand here. Columbus isn't a brilliant survivor who cracked the code of the apocalypse. He's a nervous kid who happened to not die, then built an entire identity around the fiction that his anxiety was actually intelligence, which is, relatable. But it's not exactly the survival methodology the movie keeps pretending it is. But if you think Columbus's judgment is questionable, wait until the group meets Bill Murray and somehow makes an even worse decision. The Bill Murray miscalculation. Bill Murray is the smartest character in this entire movie, and nobody in the film seems to notice or care. While Columbus and the gang are burning through gas, ammunition, and sanity on a cross-country road trip, Murray has been chilling in his Los Angeles mansion for 2 solid months. His strategy? Stay home, put on some makeup, walk around looking dead. That's it. That's the whole plan, and it works perfectly. Here's the thing. Murray's approach is demonstrably superior to everything Columbus has been preaching. No cardio required, no double tapping, no limbering up. Just stay in one place, conserve your resources, and occasionally shuffle around in zombie cosplay when you need groceries. Columbus built 33 rules for surviving the apocalypse, and Murray rendered all of them irrelevant by doing the exact opposite. The film never confronts this. It treats Murray's stationary deception method and the group's resource-depleting marathon as equally valid when one guy is living in a mansion watching Ghostbusters, and the other 4 are sleeping in gas stations. But the problems go beyond strategy. When Tallahassee meets Murray, he delivers the line 6 people left in the world, and you're one of them. Except there aren't 6. There are 5. Columbus, Tallahassee, Wichita, Little Rock, and Murray. The film's defense is that Tallahassee was counting some woman Columbus supposedly hooked up with in the back of a FedEx truck, a person whose survival status is completely unverified. So the justification for a basic math error is, well, maybe there's someone else out there we never confirmed is alive. Cool, add that to the list. The math thing is embarrassing but survivable. What isn't survivable is what happens next. Murray dies because Columbus shoots him during a prank where Murray impersonates a zombie. Tallahassee and Wichita think it's hilarious to have Murray shuffle toward Columbus in full zombie makeup, and Columbus, following every instinct his rules have drilled into him, puts a bullet in the guy. And this is where the film accidentally destroys its own logic. If a human can impersonate a zombie convincingly enough to fool trained survivors at close range, then every zombie encounter in this movie has a problem. How do you know any of them were actually zombies? Columbus has rules for double tapping, rules for cardio, rules for checking the back seat. He has 0 rules for confirming whether the thing shambling toward you is actually infected or just a guy in makeup having a really bad day. The one scenario that would matter most is the exact scenario his entire framework fails to address. Murray's death isn't just a comedic beat, it's an epistemological catastrophe. It proves that the identification problem exists, that it's lethal, and that nobody has developed any protocol for dealing with it. Columbus watched a man die because of this gap in his system, and then learned absolutely nothing from it. No new rule, no amendment, no Rule 34. Confirm zombie status before firing. Just that totally blows. And moving on. The fan-favorite scene in the movie is also the scene that quietly proves Columbus's survival philosophy is incomplete. Murray's approach was better, and the group's method for identifying threats is fundamentally broken. But hey, at least they got to meet a celebrity. If you think accidentally killing the last famous person on Earth is a miscalculation, wait until you see what happens when the girls decide to turn on every light in an amusement park. The Pacific Playland Death Trap. This is the big one. Not because it's the most obscure, but because it's the single dumbest decision any character makes in the entire film. And in a movie full of questionable choices, that's saying something. Wichita and Little Rock spent the entire movie pursuing Pacific Playland, their promised land, the one place on Earth that was totally zombie-free. They lied, stole, manipulated, and abandoned 2 perfectly capable allies just to reach this amusement park. Every stolen vehicle, every betrayal, all of it was in service of getting to this one location, and the very first thing they do when they arrive is turn on every single light and ride in the park. Pacific Playland was zombie-free for one reason, and one reason only. It was dark and quiet. There was no wall, no moat, no defense system. The park sat there in total silence, and zombies had 0 reason to wander over. The location's entire safety depended on it being invisible and inaudible, which, is not exactly a fortress. So when they flip the switch and suddenly carnival music is blasting, roller coasters are spinning, and the entire park lights up like a Christmas tree visible from miles away, they've essentially screamed "dinner's ready" to every zombie in Southern California. The park goes from the safest place on the continent to the most dangerous location in the film in about 4 seconds flat. Here's the thing, they didn't have to do this. They could have walked into the darkened park, sat on a bench, eaten some stale funnel cake, and enjoyed the exact conditions that made Pacific Playland zombie-free in the first place. Nobody forced them to activate the electrical grid. They chose spectacle over survival. And the film rewards that choice with a massive zombie siege that nearly kills everyone. And you can't even blame bad writing for the zombie attack. You have to blame the characters. Wichita is established as the smart one, the con artist, the strategist, the one who outmaneuvers Tallahassee and Columbus repeatedly. These are not idiots. And yet, the moment they reach their destination, they make the single worst tactical decision possible. It's like spending 6 months digging an underground bunker and then setting it on fire because you wanted to see what the flames looked like. Every tension beat in the finale exists because of this one choice. Columbus has to rush back to save them. Tallahassee has to lock himself in a booth and fight off a horde. Every bullet fired, every close call, every dramatic slow-motion zombie kill happens because two otherwise intelligent characters decided that riding a roller coaster was more important than staying alive. The climax only works because the script needed spectacle. It needed the lights, the music, the visual chaos of zombies swarming through a neon-lit amusement park. And honestly, it looks fantastic. One of the most visually memorable finales in zombie movie history, but it comes at the cost of its own characters' intelligence, and it retroactively makes their entire journey pointless. They didn't find a sanctuary, they found a dark parking lot with rides in it, and then they turned it into a death trap. And that's Zombieland in a nutshell. A movie so entertaining, so perfectly paced that you don't notice the logic collapsing underneath you. The rules don't hold up. The infrastructure makes no sense. The characters make decisions that would get them killed 6 times over. But none of that matters while you're watching it, because you're too busy laughing. It's only afterward, when your brain starts asking questions, that the whole thing falls apart. And honestly, that might be the most impressive trick the movie pulls. The Resident Evil movies made over $1 billion at the box office, and somehow every single one of them is broken. From a protagonist who becomes an unkillable god by film 2, to iconic game characters getting killed off-screen between sequels, to plot twists that literally erase the movie you just watched. Today I'm breaking down everything wrong with this franchise, starting with the one decision that ruined all 6 films, the Alice supremacy. Here's the thing about the Resident Evil movies. They had Jill Valentine, they had Leon Kennedy, they had Chris Redfield, characters who earned their survival through resource scarcity and barely scraping by with 3 bullets and a dream. And the films looked at all of that and said, nah, let's make up a new girl. Alice is not from the games. She was created specifically for the movies, which immediately put the franchise at odds with its source material. But that's not even the problem. The problem is what she became. In the first film, she's an amnesiac security operative. Fine, workable. By the second film, she has telekinetic powers. Zero buildup. By the fourth film, she's commanding an army of clones of herself, storming Umbrella's Tokyo headquarters like a one-woman apocalypse. And by the 6th film, she's retroactively revealed to be a clone herself, because at that point, why not? And here's where it gets damning. The filmmakers clearly knew her invulnerability was a problem because they kept trying to remove her powers. In Afterlife, Wesker injects her with a serum that neutralizes the T-virus. She literally thanks him, says it feels good to be human again. Great, tension restored. Except within minutes, the powers come back through some contrived nonsense. This happens multiple times across the franchise. They take her powers away, pretend it matters, then hand them right back. It's like watching someone put a band-aid on a gunshot wound and then rip it off because they got bored. But the worst part isn't what Alice became. It's what she did to everyone else. Every game character gets systematically reduced to a background extra. Jill Valentine becomes secondary. Leon accomplishes basically nothing. Chris Redfield exists to stand behind Alice and look concerned. These are characters who carry entire games on their backs, and in the movies, they can't even carry a subplot. Alice didn't just fail as a character. She was a black hole at the center of this franchise. Everything orbited her, and anything that got too close got consumed. But if you think one overpowered protagonist is bad, wait until you hear what they did to the actual story. Because the retcons in this franchise don't just bend the plot, they snap it in half. The great retcon. The first Resident Evil film has problems, sure, but it also has one genuinely clever twist. Alice was never just a security guard. She was a mole. She'd become disillusioned with Umbrella, teamed up with Lisa Addison to smuggle out evidence of the company's crimes, and the entire third act reframes everything you've watched. Alice had a real history, real relationships, and a real moral awakening that drove her to betray the most powerful corporation on the planet. And then the final chapter came along and said, actually, none of that happened. Here's the thing. The sixth film reveals that Alice is a clone of Alicia Marcus, the daughter of Umbrella co-founder James Marcus. Her consciousness literally began in that shower scene from the opening of the first movie. She didn't lose her memories because of the Red Queen's nerve gas. She lost her memories because she never had any. Dr. Isaacs says it directly. You have no memory because you have no life. Great line if you ignore the fact that it demolishes 5 films of character development in about 4 seconds. Think about what this actually means. If Alice's first moment of existence was waking up on that bathroom floor, then her backstory with Lisa Addison is either implanted memories or complete fiction. Her ethical conversion, her decision to sabotage Umbrella from within, all of it becomes meaningless. She didn't choose to do the right thing, she was manufactured to do it. The Red Queen apparently programmed her with a subconscious mission to stop Umbrella, which transforms Alice from a person with agency into an automaton running pre-installed software. But here's where it gets really frustrating. The film never actually clarifies whether Alice genuinely participated in the events of the first movie or not. Did she really work at the Hive? Did she really know Lisa? The movie just shrugs. It needed the first film's events to have happened for its own plot to make sense, but its central revelation makes those events impossible as originally presented. Nobody involved seemed to notice or care, and the Red Queen knew. Alicia Marcus knew. They both apparently understood Alice was a clone from the very beginning and just decided not to mention it across 5 entire films, for reasons that are never explained. Not vaguely explained, never explained. A good retcon takes something confusing and makes it clearer. This retcon takes something that worked perfectly fine and detonates it. Alice goes from a character who made a brave moral choice to a blank hard drive that booted up with someone else's conscience preloaded, which is, not ideal, but at least Alice got to exist in the story long enough to be retconned. Some characters didn't even get that courtesy. The Vanishing Cast. Let me set the scene for you. It's the end of Retribution. Alice, Jill Valentine, Ada Wong, Leon Kennedy, and a little girl named Becky are all standing at the White House. Humanity's last stand, thousands of zombies closing in. Wesker hands Alice her powers back. The camera pulls out to reveal an army of undead stretching to the horizon, and the screen cuts to black. That's your cliffhanger. That's your promise. The next movie is going to be the battle for the White House, the final war for humanity, featuring every major character the franchise has been building toward for 5 films. The final chapter opens, and every single one of those characters is dead. Not dead in a dramatic sacrifice. Not dead in a heroic last stand you get to witness. Dead off-screen, between films, with zero explanation and zero acknowledgement that they ever existed. The White House battle that was explicitly set up as the centerpiece of the next film, they skipped it. The movie opens with Alice crawling out of rubble alone, and that's it. That's what you get. Here's where it gets genuinely insulting. If you want to know how Jill, Ada, Leon, and Becky actually died, you have to read the novelization, a book. The deaths of franchise-spanning characters based on iconic video game protagonists were deemed so unimportant they couldn't spare 30 seconds of screen time. You need to buy supplementary reading material to understand why the 6th movie starts the way it does. Cool, that's also a thing that happened, but the worst part isn't the off-screen deaths. It's the silence afterward. Alice never mentions any of them, not once. Not a single line acknowledging Jill Valentine, a character who appeared in multiple films. Not a passing reference to Leon. Not a moment of grief for Becky, the child she risked her life to protect in the previous movie. These people simply stop existing. They are not mourned, not referenced, not even used as motivation. These weren't background extras. Jill had a multi-film arc involving mind control and redemption. Leon and Ada were brought in specifically because fans demanded game protagonists get real screen time. They finally got it, and then they were deleted before they could do anything with it. It's the franchise's most cowardly narrative decision. The filmmakers promised an epic conclusion, realized they couldn't deliver it, and instead of finding a creative solution, they pretended it never happened. They took the most anticipated sequence in the entire series and replaced it with nothing. Literally nothing. A time skip and some rubble. But if the Vanishing Cast feels like a betrayal of individual characters, wait until you see what the franchise did to the entire world it built, the global apocalypse. Here's something that should bother you way more than it does. In the games, the Raccoon City outbreak happens in 1998. It's devastating, but governments respond like competent organizations. The military moves in. A nuclear missile wipes the city off the map. International bodies form to deal with bioweapon threats going forward. It's grim, but it's logical. The first Resident Evil film actually respects this. The Hive outbreak is bad, Raccoon City gets overrun, and then the nuke drops. Contained. Done. Then extinction happens, and suddenly the entire planet looks like Mars with worse parking. By the third film, the T-virus has somehow caused complete global ecological destruction. Oceans are drying up. Deserts have swallowed entire cities. Characters are wandering the Mojave like it's a Mad Max audition nobody asked for. And the timeline for this? Roughly 3 years. Raccoon City gets nuked in 2002, and by 2005, nearly every human on Earth is either infected or dead. 3 years. From one contained city outbreak to the near total extinction of the human species. For context, that's less time than it takes most people to finish a degree. The games show coordinated global response teams, quarantine protocols, and international bioweapon treaties. The movies show everybody apparently going on lunch break while civilization collapses. But here's the kicker. The final chapter tries to retroactively explain this by revealing that Umbrella's leadership unanimously voted to deliberately release the T-virus worldwide. The reason? Overpopulation. Their brilliant strategy was to wipe out humanity, wait 10 years, then release an airborne antivirus while thawing out cryogenically preserved Umbrella employees to repopulate the Earth, which is, not ideal as a business plan. This revelation is clearly the filmmakers trying to patch a plot hole they created 3 movies earlier. Why did the whole world collapse from one city outbreak? Because Umbrella did it on purpose. Cool. Except the films never established this during the actual apocalypse. We never see Umbrella releasing the virus globally. We never see governments failing to respond. We just jump from one city got nuked to Earth is a barren wasteland with zero connective tissue. The conspiracy explanation doesn't even fully work, because the second film treats the outbreak spread as accidental, not orchestrated. So either Umbrella's master plan involved looking surprised when their own plan worked, or the writers simply forgot what story they were telling. And nobody in the film seems particularly curious about how this happened. Alice never asks. The survivors never discuss it. An entire species got wiped out in less time than a presidential term, and the characters treat it like weather. Oh, the apocalypse? Yeah, that happened. Anyway, but if the global timeline is a mess, wait until you see what they did to Albert Wesker, because that man's character arc makes even less sense than the end of the world. The Wesker inconsistency. Albert Wesker should have been the best thing about these movies. He has superhuman strength, regenerative healing, a god complex the size of a small continent, and the kind of cold ruthlessness that makes for a genuinely terrifying antagonist. And for about 45 minutes of screen time across 4 films, he actually is. In Afterlife, Wesker does something almost nobody else in this franchise manages. He wins. He strips Alice of her powers, demonstrates superior combat ability, and literally asks her for her last words. That's your endgame villain, the guy who beat the unbeatable protagonist and looked bored doing it, and then he just doesn't kill her. The man who injected himself with a prototype virus to become a living weapon, who has zero moral hesitation about anything, decides that confirming Alice's death after detonating a facility-destroying bomb is apparently optional. He walks away. She survives. Cool, add that to the list. But here's where it gets genuinely stupid. By retribution, Wesker has flipped from ultimate antagonist to reluctant ally. He injects Alice with the T-virus to restore her powers, because he needs her help defending the White House against the Red Queen. The guy who spent an entire film trying to destroy her is now handing her abilities back on a silver platter. The justification for this character reversal is roughly the situation changed, which is, not a motivation. Then the final chapter reveals that Wesker's alliance was itself a trap. The White House defense was a setup, and the last stand he orchestrated was just a scheme to lure Alice in. So let me walk you through this. Wesker defeats Alice and takes her powers, then gives her powers back to fight alongside him. Then it turns out he was planning to betray her the entire time. So his master plan was win, then pretend to lose, then genuinely empower the person he beat with superhuman abilities, then try to kill them again. That's not a scheme. That's a man having a series of small strokes. Here's the thing that really twists the knife. In the games, Wesker is genuinely brilliant. His defeats come from unforeseen circumstances and protagonists who get lucky at exactly the right moment. Game Wesker nearly wins every single time, and when he loses, it feels earned. Film Wesker loses because he forgot to look behind him. Film Wesker loses because he didn't bother checking whether his bomb actually killed the one person he needed dead. Film Wesker's plans fail not because of heroic opposition, but because of catastrophic negligence, which the script frames as arrogance but which functions identically to a man forgetting his car keys every single morning. He started as the franchise's most credible threat and ended as a plot device whose allegiance shifts based entirely on what the current film needs him to be. Villain this movie, ally next movie, double agent the movie after that. Not because of character development, because the script required it. But if you think Wesker's identity crisis is bad, wait until you see what they did to the Red Queen, because that AI changes personalities more often than most people change clothes. The Red Queen identity crisis. The Red Queen is the single most contradictory character in the entire franchise, and that's saying something considering what they did to Wesker. Here's the thing. In the first film, the Red Queen is the villain. She seals the hive, floods chambers with halon gas, and activates a laser grid that slices through an entire commando team like deli meat. Multiple people die screaming because this AI decided the best way to handle a viral outbreak was to murder every living person inside the facility. Cool, she's a killer robot. We're all on the same page. Then she disappears for 3 films, not reduced to a background role. Gone. Films 2 through 4, the Red Queen is either completely absent or referenced only as a hostile system that nearly killed everyone. Nobody misses her. Nobody calls her for advice. She's the psychotic computer that murdered their friends. But then, the final chapter happens, and suddenly the Red Queen contacts Alice directly to propose an alliance. She tells Alice that Umbrella's plan to wipe out the remaining human population conflicts with her core programming, and she can no longer stand by. She provides strategic intel, warns about timelines, and essentially becomes the most important ally in the entire film. And here's where it gets completely inexplicable. The final chapter reveals that the Red Queen was built using the template of Alicia Marcus, and that she was always programmed with 2 directives: follow all Umbrella orders and protect human life, always. From the beginning. Let that sink in for a second. If the Red Queen was always programmed to protect human life, then the laser corridor in the first film cannot have happened. Those were Umbrella employees, humans. The Red Queen activated a defense system specifically designed to cut people into pieces and killed them one by one. You cannot program an AI with a prime directive to preserve humanity and then have that same AI gleefully execute a room full of people with a laser grid. Those 2 things are mutually exclusive. The White Queen even mentions in an earlier film that the Red Queen's actions were always for the preservation of human life. This is framed as foreshadowing, but it's not foreshadowing if the thing you're foreshadowing directly contradicts every single thing the character did on screen. That's not clever writing. That's hoping nobody remembers the first movie. And the convenience factor is staggering. When the plot needs exposition about Umbrella's secret plans, the Red Queen is suddenly omniscient and chatty. When the plot needs Alice to struggle alone, the Red Queen is mysteriously unavailable. She can warn Alice about a 2-day deadline to save humanity, but she can't open a door. She can reveal decades of Umbrella conspiracy in a single conversation, but she couldn't mention any of this during the previous 15 years of global apocalypse. Her capabilities expand and contract based entirely on what the screenplay needs in that specific scene. The Red Queen isn't a character. She's a narrative cheat code the writers activate when they've written themselves into a corner, which is, not ideal for your franchise's most iconic AI. But if you think a flip-flopping supercomputer is bad for the horror genre, wait until you see what the franchise did to survival horror itself, the action horror conflict. Here's something people forget. The original Resident Evil game didn't just belong to the survival horror genre, it literally invented the term. The back of the box for the 1996 PlayStation release is the first known use of survival horror as a genre classification. That game defined an entire category built on specific rules. You don't have enough ammo, the spaces are too tight, the enemies are too strong, and you are going to die a lot. The entire point is that you are vulnerable. The films understood this for about 45 minutes of the first movie, and then never again. The first Resident Evil film actually has some survival horror DNA in it. The Hive is claustrophobic. The team gets picked apart. Characters die because they make mistakes, not because the plot needs an action beat. You can squint and see the source material in there. But by Afterlife, every element of survival horror has been surgically removed and replaced with slow-motion action choreography from a completely different franchise. The opening sequence is genuinely the most anti-survival horror thing ever committed to screen. Alice leads an army of clones, hundreds of them, into the Tokyo Umbrella facility. They massacre everyone in minutes. Hundreds of superpowered identical women mowing down soldiers with zero resistance, zero tension. That's not survival horror. That's a power fantasy with zombies in the background. Look at how the environments evolve. The first film gives you the Hive's corridors, tight turns, locked doors. By the third film, you're in the open Mojave Desert. By the fourth, massive underground chambers designed for vehicular sequences. By the fifth, simulated suburban neighborhoods built for gunfights. Every single film pushes the setting further from claustrophobia and closer to large empty space where cool flips can happen. Then there's the creatures. In the games, Nemesis is one of the most terrifying enemies ever designed. He stalks you across multiple areas. You can't kill him easily. The optimal strategy is literally to run away. In Apocalypse, Nemesis shows up and gets defeated through a choreographed fight sequence. Alice doesn't outsmart him. She doesn't barely escape. She beats him in combat. Because by that point, Alice can beat anything in combat, which means nothing is scary anymore. This is the fundamental problem. Horror requires vulnerability. The moment your protagonist can telekinetically crush a room full of enemies, you don't have horror. You have an action movie wearing a horror costume. And the franchise kept escalating Alice's powers while trying to maintain the Resident Evil branding, which is like calling something a stealth game while giving the player a tank. Here's the kicker. When the franchise was rebooted, the entire marketing campaign centered on one promise. This time, it would actually be scary. Tight spaces, genuine dread, boots on the ground terror instead of superhuman spectacle. The filmmakers essentially said we're going back to what Resident Evil is supposed to be, which is a polite way of confirming that 6 films and 15 years of the Anderson franchise had completely abandoned the genre identity of its own source material. When actually being scary is your reboot's selling point, the original franchise has failed at its most basic job. But if you think abandoning the genre was bad, wait until you see what these films did to their own endings. Every single time. The cliffhanger reset. Here's the thing about every single problem we've talked about so far. The bad adaptations, the vanishing characters, the lore contradictions, the villain who forgot how to be scary. All of that could theoretically be forgiven if the films at least respected their own story from one entry to the next. They didn't, not even a little bit. The Resident Evil franchise developed a very specific habit. Each film would end on a massive cliffhanger, some dramatic promise of what was coming next, and then the following film would open by quietly erasing that promise and pretending it never happened. This wasn't a one-time creative pivot. This was the franchise's entire operating system. Let me walk you through the worst example. Retribution ends with Wesker injecting Alice with the T-virus to restore her superhuman powers. This is framed as a huge moment. The music swells. Wesker, the longtime villain, is now an ally. Alice is back at full strength. They're standing at the White House with Jill Valentine, Leon Kennedy, and Ada Wong, preparing for humanity's last stand. Roll credits. See you in the sequel. The final chapter opens, and literally, none of that matters. The White House is destroyed. Alice is the sole survivor. Every character standing beside her at the end of Retribution is dead. The opening monologue just waves its hand and says, yeah, that was all a trap by Wesker, as if that resolves anything. It doesn't. It raises about 40 new questions and answers 0 of them. But the real gut punch is the powers. Remember that dramatic injection scene? The one the entire 5th film built toward? The Red Queen casually reveals that Wesker faked it. The T-virus injection that served as the climactic moment of an entire movie was retroactively theater, which means every audience member who watched that scene and felt something was, in the politest possible terms, suckered. And this pattern repeats across the entire franchise. The second film contradicts the first film's timeline. The third film shifts from contained outbreak to global extinction without explanation. The fourth film introduces an army of Alice clones with 0 setup. The fifth film builds an elaborate scenario that the sixth film immediately abandons. Every single sequel opens by invalidating the movie before it. This is not storytelling. This is a franchise that treats its own continuity like a rough draft it can scribble over whenever it wants. The retconning wasn't an occasional tool to fix a plot hole. It was the primary narrative mechanism. Not cause and effect, not character development, not escalating stakes. Erasure. And the worst part? It worked. Not creatively, obviously, but commercially. The franchise made over $1.2 billion at the global box office, which means audiences kept showing up, even after being told repeatedly that nothing they watched in the previous film actually counted. That's either bizarre loyalty or proof that people will sit through anything if you put enough explosions in it. By the time the 6th film rolled around, even dedicated analysts had given up trying to make the timeline work. The most honest assessment anyone could offer was essentially, we don't know why. We don't want to know why. That's not criticism. That's surrender. The franchise had so thoroughly trained its audience to stop caring about narrative investment that the only rational response was resigned bafflement, and that, ultimately, is the franchise's greatest sin. Not the bad adaptations, not turning survival horror into a Matrix knockoff, not killing beloved characters off screen. It's that they broke the most basic contract between a storyteller and an audience. The contract that says, if you invest your time and attention, the story will at least try to make sense. The Resident Evil films didn't try. They just kept resetting, kept retconning, kept promising things they had zero intention of delivering. And when the dust settled, they left behind 6 films, $1 billion, and a fan base that learned the hard way that none of it ever meant anything. The Walking Dead ran for 11 seasons, and somehow found a way to make every single villain say the exact same thing. Survival requires sacrifice, civilization needs a firm hand. I'm the only one who understands how the world works now. Different face, same TED Talk. So today we're breaking down everything wrong with The Walking Dead, starting with the most forgivable sin on the list: excessive villain monologuing. Here's the thing about The Walking Dead's villains. They love to talk. Every major antagonist this show has ever produced could have been defeated by simply not giving them a platform to deliver a speech. It starts with the governor. He occupied the antagonist role for Season 3 and the first half of Season 4, and while David Morrissey did a fantastic job, the template he established became a curse. The governor didn't just threaten people. He explained why he was threatening them. He contextualized his violence. He gave you the full philosophical breakdown before doing anything remotely scary. And the writers looked at that and said, yeah, let's do this exact thing 5 more times. Gareth shows up at Terminus and immediately starts monologuing about the nature of survival. Alpha delivers poetic speeches about embracing death. Pamela Milton in Season 11 literally explains her own corruption out loud like she's narrating a documentary about herself. Cool. Thanks, Pamela. We couldn't have possibly figured that out from watching you do it, but nobody perfected the art of saying too much quite like Negan. Jeffrey Dean Morgan walked onto the show swinging a bat and never stopped swinging sentences. I am everywhere, Rick. People are a resource. 15 variations of the same profanity-laced power fantasy delivered with a lean and a grin. For about half a season, it worked. Then it became self-parody. You knew exactly what Negan was going to say before he said it, which is, not ideal for a character whose entire appeal is supposed to be unpredictability. The fundamental problem is that every villain delivered the same thesis wearing a different costume. Survival requires ruthlessness. The weak serve the strong. The show violated the most basic rule of storytelling, show don't tell, by having antagonists explain their worldview through monologues instead of letting audiences discover it through consequences. Compare this to Anton Chigurh, who barely speaks and terrifies you through action alone, or Gustavo Fring, who communicates more threat in a single silent stare than Negan managed in 3 seasons of speeches. Silence is scary. Speeches are lectures. This is the most forgivable problem on the list because it's a writing habit, not a catastrophic decision. The show still functioned with chatty villains. But if you think repetitive dialogue is bad, wait until you see what they did with the Commonwealth Arc, the Commonwealth Arc Execution. For 10 seasons, The Walking Dead was a show about small communities scraping by, farms, prisons, walled suburbs, the occasional cannibal train station. The scale was intimate, personal. Then, in the final season, the show decided to introduce an entire functioning civilization with a class system, a military, and a governor who wears blazers, and somehow expected us to care about it in 24 episodes. Here's the thing. The concept was genuinely interesting. After a decade of watching survivors debate whether humanity could rebuild, the Commonwealth was supposed to be the answer. A massive, advanced society that had actually done it. The conflict wasn't, can we survive the walkers anymore? It was, can civilization exist without becoming corrupt? That's a fantastic question. The show just had zero interest in actually exploring it. The setup was promising enough. Season 10 ended with Eugene, Ezekiel, Yumiko, and Princess, surrounded by Commonwealth soldiers in full stormtrooper gear, visors down, weapons raised, the whole intimidation package. It looked like the show was about to introduce its most dangerous threat yet. Instead, what we got was a bureaucratic villain who talked a lot about order and stability while occasionally doing something evil off-screen. Governor Pamela Milton was supposed to be a different kind of antagonist. Not a bat-swinging psychopath, not a skin-wearing cult leader, but a political operator willing to sacrifice her own people to maintain power. When massive walker herds descended on the Commonwealth during the chaos and unrest her policies created, she used the crisis as an excuse to crack down, tighten control, and abandon the lower-class citizens to die behind locked gates. which is, not ideal. But the show told us about her corruption through dialogue instead of showing it through escalating consequences. Characters would stand around explaining how bad things were getting, rather than letting us watch things actually get bad. And then there's the resolution. Ezekiel becomes governor. Mercer takes command of the Commonwealth military. Democracy is restored. Everyone claps. This political transition that should have been the emotional climax of an 11-season journey got compressed into roughly the same amount of screen time as a Negan monologue. It felt less like a grand finale and more like someone speed reading the last chapter of a book they needed to return to the library. In the comics, Rick's death at Sebastian Milton's hands was already considered anticlimactic, murdered by the spoiled, abusive son of the Commonwealth's leader. Not in battle, not saving someone, just shot by a rich kid throwing a tantrum. The show wisely avoided replicating that exact beat, but it never found a satisfying alternative either. The Commonwealth arc was an okay plotline for a single season. As the ending of an 11-year series, it was a footnote pretending to be a finale. But if you think a rushed ending was the franchise's biggest problem, wait until you see what AMC did with the spin-offs. The endless spin-off bloat. Here's something AMC never quite figured out. When your audience leaves, the correct response is not to build more rooms in the house. 7 television series, 355 episodes, 28 seasons. That's the current size of the Walking Dead franchise, and if those numbers sound impressive, they shouldn't, because almost nobody is watching any of it. Let's start with the canary in the coal mine that everybody ignored. World Beyond launched in 2020 as a 2-season limited series focused on the first generation of survivors who grew up entirely in the apocalypse. Great concept. Terrible everything else. The characters felt less like real people and more like rough sketches someone forgot to finish. The young cast delivered performances so stiff and unconvincing you'd think they were reading cue cards for the first time. Scenes that should have been tense and gripping turned into dull stretches where absolutely nothing felt at stake. And the writing? Cringeworthy is the polite way to put it. The whole thing felt hollow, like a Walking Dead episode that had been left out in the sun too long. It got canceled after 2 seasons. Which is the nicest thing that ever happened to it. Now, a normal franchise would look at World Beyond and think, okay, maybe we should slow down. AMC looked at it and said, what if we made more shows? So they made The Ones Who Live, a miniseries reuniting Rick and Michonne that should have been the biggest event in the franchise's history. Instead, it averaged somewhere between 850,000 and 910,000 viewers per episode across its 6-episode run. For context, the main series peaked at 17 million viewers. That's a 95% decline. That's not a ratings dip. That's an extinction event. But wait, it gets worse. Daryl Dixon Season 3 premiered to just 241,000 viewers. That's barely half the audience that watched the Season 2 finale. And then one episode dropped to 198,000 viewers, setting the record for the least watched episode of any Walking Dead hour-long spin-off in history. 198,000 people. You could fit that audience inside a mid-sized college football stadium and still have empty seats. The franchise went from 17 million viewers to 198,000. I genuinely don't know what to tell you. That's like opening the biggest restaurant in town, watching all your customers leave because the food got bad, and then responding by opening 6 more restaurants. The logic is baffling, and that's the core problem. AMC confused quantity with quality. They assumed that more content set in this universe would automatically sustain engagement, as if the Walking Dead brand alone was enough to keep people tuning in. But brands don't sustain audiences. Stories do. And by the time these spin-offs launched, the underlying trust in the franchise's ability to tell a good story had already been shattered. Nobody was asking for 7 shows. People could barely finish the one they started with. But if the spin-off bloat represents the franchise's refusal to read the room, the pacing of the original series is what drove people to the door in the first place. Pacing and filler episodes. Here's the thing about The Walking Dead's pacing problems. They weren't an accident. They weren't a creative choice. They were a business decision. And you can trace the exact moment it all went wrong. Season 1 had 6 episodes. 6. And it was incredible. Tight, focused, every scene mattered. Then AMC looked at the ratings, fired Frank Darabont, slashed the budget by 25%, and in the same breath ordered 13 episodes for Season 2. Let me just repeat that so it sinks in. They cut the money and nearly tripled the episode count, which is, not ideal. The result was an entire season confined almost entirely to Herschel's farm. Fewer locations, fewer walkers, fewer action sequences, and a whole lot of people standing around talking about whether they should leave the farm. They did not leave the farm. Not for a very long time. Season 2 became synonymous with slow television, remembered for its lethargic pace, repetitive scenes, and a near-total absence of major events until the final stretch. And the worst part is that it wasn't the writers' fault. They were handed an impossible equation: make more show with less money. The math doesn't work. It never worked. But instead of learning from this, AMC doubled down. The network's business model demanded 13 to 16 episodes per season, regardless of whether the story actually needed that many hours. Breaking Bad told its final story in 16 episodes across 2 seasons, because that's what the narrative required. The Walking Dead told stories in 16 episodes, because that's what the ad revenue required. Writers were forced to either stretch plots way past their natural breaking point, or manufacture entire episodes of filler content that viewers could identify as skippable within the first 5 minutes, and viewers did identify them quickly. You could take most hour-long episodes from the middle seasons and compress the actual plot advancement into maybe 30 minutes. The rest was walking, contemplative staring, long tracking shots of abandoned buildings, characters having the same argument they had 2 episodes ago but in a slightly different room. The crown jewel of filler was Season 10, Episode 21, Diverged. It followed Daryl and Carol after they split up, and almost nothing happened. Daryl fixed a motorcycle. Carol made soup. A rat appeared. The rat left. Fans said this single episode embodied every negative criticism the show had ever received, all packed into 42 minutes of nothing. It was like someone distilled the concept of filler into its purest form and aired it on purpose. The tragedy is that the talent was there. The actors could deliver. The writers could write compelling drama when given room to breathe and a story worth telling. But AMC's assembly line approach meant quantity always won over quality, and the show became a weekly gamble where you'd tune in hoping for plot and get 50 minutes of people looking pensively at trees. But if you think wasted time was frustrating, wait until we talk about the show's other favorite trick: making you think someone died, and then going just kidding so many times you stopped caring entirely. Plot armor and fake-out deaths. Glenn Rhee died in Season 6, Episode 3. Walkers surrounded him and Nicholas on top of a dumpster. Nicholas shot himself, and both of them fell into the horde. The camera showed a body being ripped apart, intestines everywhere. Glenn screaming. It was brutal, it was final, and it was a lie. Glenn didn't die. He crawled under the dumpster while Nicholas's body was devoured on top of him. And the show didn't bother telling you that for 3 full episodes. 3 weeks of silence. No Glenn, no confirmation, just the audience sitting there wondering if the show had actually done it. Turns out, no. He was fine, just hanging out under a dumpster while 100 walkers apparently lost interest and wandered off. Here's the thing. That moment rewired how every single viewer watched the show from that point forward. It created an unspoken rule in millions of people's heads. If you don't see the body, they're alive. And once that rule exists, you can't unlearn it. Every dramatic death scene after the dumpster became a guessing game instead of an emotional experience. The show trained its audience to be cynical instead of invested, which is, not ideal for a drama that depends on you caring whether people live or die. And Glenn wasn't even the worst offender. Daryl gets shot point blank by Dwight at the end of an episode. Blood splatters across the screen. Cut to black. Next episode, minor shoulder wound. Morgan survived multiple sequences where the show framed his death as imminent, only to walk it back every time. Carol endured situations that would have killed any other character 3 times over, but she kept standing because the writers needed her for another season. But here's where the real damage happened. The show established rules for its own universe. A single bite kills you. A herd of walkers is a death sentence for anyone caught in the open, except those rules only applied to minor characters. Background survivors would die because they tripped or made one bad call. Meanwhile, Rick could wade through a crowd of walkers covered in guts and emerge without a scratch. Negan could stand in the middle of a battlefield for entire episodes and never catch a stray bullet. The cumulative effect was desensitization, not to violence, but to consequence. When a show tells you someone is dead and then reveals they aren't, it spends a little bit of trust. When it does that repeatedly across multiple seasons with multiple characters, it goes bankrupt. By the time the show killed characters who were genuinely supposed to stay dead, the audience had been so conditioned to doubt permanence that the deaths landed with a fraction of their intended impact. You can't cry wolf for 6 seasons and then expect people to feel something when the wolf actually shows up. Every fake out made the next real death less meaningful. Every miraculous survival made the next dangerous situation less tense. The show needed you to believe that anyone could die at any time. That was the entire premise. And then it spent years proving that wasn't true for anyone the writers liked enough to keep around. But if the dumpster scene was the moment the show started losing audience trust, the Season 6 finale was the moment it set that trust on fire and walked away. The Season 6 cliffhanger let me set the scene. For half a season, the show had been building toward one thing: Negan. The Saviors had been creeping into the story, killing people, blocking roads. tightening the noose around Rick's group with every episode. Jeffrey Dean Morgan walks out of that RV, delivers the eeny, meeny, mini, mo speech, raises Lucille above his head, swings, and cut to black. Blood drips down the screen. Credits roll, and the entire fan base lost its mind. Not in a good way. Here's the thing. A cliffhanger works when it makes you desperate to see what happens next. This one made people furious. The show had spent months building to the most anticipated villain introduction since the series began, and then refused to actually show it. The audience didn't feel suspense. They felt cheated. There's a massive difference between "I can't wait to find out" and "are you kidding me right now?" And the season 6 finale landed squarely on the wrong side of that line. But here's where it gets worse. This wasn't even the first time season 6 pulled this exact trick. Earlier that same season, Glenn appeared to die in a walker horde after falling off a dumpster. Viewers mourned. Social media exploded. 3 episodes later, surprise, he crawled under the dumpster and was totally fine. So by the time the finale aired, audiences had already been burned by a fake-out death. Their patience was gone. And now, the show was asking them to wait 6 months to find out who Negan killed. Cool, add that to the list. The real tragedy is what this did to Negan's introduction. Jeffrey Dean Morgan was clearly having the time of his life. The monologue, the swagger, the casual cruelty. It should have been legendary television. Instead of anyone talking about how terrifying Negan was, the entire conversation became about the cliffhanger format. The creative decision overshadowed the creative achievement. That's not suspense. That's self-sabotage. And the numbers prove it. Season 7 premiered to 17.03 million viewers, riding the wave of who did Negan kill speculation. But by episode 6, viewership had collapsed to 10.4 million. That's a drop back to season 3 levels within 6 episodes. People tuned in for the answer, got it, and left permanently. The cliffhanger didn't generate loyalty. It generated a transaction. Viewers came back to collect what the show owed them, then walked out the door. Comic readers already knew Glenn was Negan's victim in the source material. The show had already spent the shock of Glenn's death through the dumpster fake-out. So when the premiere finally confirmed it, the reaction wasn't devastation. It was, yeah, we figured. The show managed to waste the same character death twice in one season, which is genuinely impressive if you think about it. First they pretended to kill him, burning the emotional impact. Then they actually killed him, but hid it behind a cliffhanger, burning the dramatic payoff. A double failure that turned what should have been the show's most gut-wrenching moment into a case study in how not to handle audience expectations. But if losing 6.6 million viewers in 6 episodes sounds bad, wait until you hear what happened when the show lost its actual lead. The departure of Rick Grimes. Rick Grimes was the Walking Dead. Not Daryl, not Carol, not Negan. Rick. He was the guy who woke up in that hospital bed in 2010, and for 8 years, every single narrative thread in the show connected back to him. His survival, his leadership, his willingness to do terrible things for the people he loved. That was the show. So when Andrew Lincoln stood up at the 2018 San Diego Comic-Con and announced he was leaving after season 9, the show didn't just lose its lead actor. It lost its reason for existing, and the way they wrote him out was somehow worse than just killing him. Rick gets caught in an explosion on a bridge, gets swept downstream, and just disappears. No body, no confirmation, no closure. The show's protagonist of nearly a decade got the narrative equivalent of he went to live on a farm upstate, which is, not ideal, but here's where AMC pulled out the big guns. They announced a trilogy of theatrical films that would follow Rick's journey, explain where he'd been taken, and give the character the definitive ending he deserved. 3 movies, theatrical releases, the full Hollywood treatment for a cable TV character. It was ambitious, it was exciting. It was also completely fictional, because none of those films ever got made. The official story is that the pandemic disrupted production. And sure, that's true, but the pandemic ended. Productions resumed across the entire entertainment industry. Somehow every other major franchise figured out how to get back on track, but the Rick Grimes trilogy just quietly evaporated. By the time conditions normalized, the project had apparently run its course. Nobody at AMC seemed particularly interested in explaining what happened. The films just stopped being mentioned. Like a relative nobody wants to talk about at Thanksgiving. Meanwhile, the main series kept going. 2 more full seasons without its central character. Daryl stepped up. Maggie came back. Negan got a redemption arc. But the show felt fundamentally different, like a band playing without its lead singer and hoping nobody notices. The thematic engine that had driven 11 years of storytelling was gone. Rick wanted to build a safe world for Carl. Carl was dead. Rick was gone. So what exactly was the show about now? Nobody had a convincing answer. 6 years later, in 2024, AMC finally resolved Rick's story through The Ones Who Live, a miniseries starring Andrew Lincoln and Danai Gurira, and it was fine, perfectly watchable television. But it averaged under 1 million viewers per episode. Let that sink in. A show that once pulled 17 million viewers per episode produced a spin-off resolving its protagonist's fate, and fewer than 1 million people showed up. The audience that spent years demanding to know what happened to Rick Grimes had largely stopped caring. They'd already grieved. They'd already moved on. The payoff arrived to an empty room. This is the ultimate symbol of everything wrong with The Walking Dead's later years. Overpromise, underdeliver, then act surprised when people stop believing you. 3 theatrical films became one miniseries that barely registered. A protagonist's journey that began in 2010 didn't get its conclusion until 2024, and by then, the emotional statute of limitations had expired. But if you think losing Rick was the killing blow, you need to understand what happened right before he left, because AMC didn't just remove the show's protagonist, they removed the entire reason his story mattered in the first place. The death of Carl Grimes. This is the one that broke everything. Not the cliffhanger, not Rick leaving, not the filler episodes. This. Because when The Walking Dead killed Carl Grimes, it didn't just kill a character. It killed its own thesis statement. Chandler Riggs appeared in this show from the very first episode. He was there when Rick woke up in that hospital. He was there through the farm, the prison, Terminus, Alexandria, Negan, all of it. 8 seasons. Carl Grimes wasn't just Rick's son, he was the entire point. The show's argument that survival meant something beyond just not dying. The next generation, the proof that you could build something worth inheriting, and they killed him with a random walker bite during a scavenging run. This kid survived the governor's assault on the prison. He survived Terminus. He survived Negan lining everyone up and bashing skulls in. 8 seasons of escalating world-ending threats. And the thing that finally got him was a bite he picked up almost incidentally during a routine supply grab. His final appearance came in the episode Honor, February 25th, 2018, and it felt less like a meaningful character conclusion and more like the show tripping over its own shoelaces and snapping its neck on the way down. Here's where it gets really frustrating. Carl was the one character who consistently pushed for a better future. He wanted to stop the cycle. Every other character was reacting to the apocalypse. Carl was the only one actively trying to move past it, and the show just removed him from the board. Not because the story demanded it, but because they needed an emotional beat for Rick. Carl's death existed to make Rick sad. That's it. That was the function, which means Carl didn't get a death scene. Rick got a grief scene. There's a difference, and it matters. Rick's entire character arc was built on the father-son dynamic. Every brutal decision, every moral compromise, it all carried weight because you understood he was doing it for Carl. Take Carl away and Rick's journey becomes abstract. He's just a guy making hard choices in a bad world. No emotional anchor, no stakes that feel personal. Without Carl, what was Rick even fighting for? The show couldn't answer that question, and within a season, Andrew Lincoln was gone too. Cool, add that to the list. But the real damage was thematic. The Commonwealth arc, the entire endgame of the series, was supposed to be about building civilization again. Carl was supposed to inherit that world. He was the character who would have made that ending mean something. Instead, the show stumbled into its final act, arguing that the future mattered, while having already killed the character who represented the future. It's like burning down your house and then trying to sell someone on the kitchen renovations. The community response wasn't just disappointment, it was betrayal. Fans didn't feel like the show had made a bold creative choice. They felt like it had sacrificed its most important long-term asset for short-term shock value. And they were right. Carl's death didn't open up new storytelling possibilities. It closed them permanently. This wasn't just a bad decision. This was the show looking at 8 years of emotional investment and saying none of it was going to pay off. The kid who was supposed to prove that survival had meaning died meaninglessly, and that told you everything you needed to know about where The Walking Dead was headed. Nowhere good. Fear the Walking Dead had one job. One single job that justified its entire existence. Show us the fall of civilization that The Walking Dead skipped. Show us the hospitals shutting down, the military checkpoints collapsing, the moment your neighbor stops being your neighbor. Instead, the show did something so baffling it still makes fans angry years later. It skipped it too. And the reason why is even worse than you think. The skipped transition. Season 3 of Fear the Walking Dead is genuinely great television. It ends with a dam exploding, the Clark family scattered, and the entire world of the show cracking open in a way that promised something incredible. That finale aired on October 15th, 2017. Season 4 premiered on April 15th, 2018. And when it came back, everything had changed. Not in an exciting way, we literally skipped the most important part of the story way. Between those 2 seasons, the show jumped forward in time. Weeks, possibly months of survival happened entirely off camera. Characters whose fates were left hanging after the dam explosion just showed up in new locations with zero explanation. The transitional period between societies society is crumbling and full apocalypse was gone. Poof. The one thing this show existed to depict, and they cut it like a deleted scene on a DVD nobody bought. Here's where it gets worse. The reason for the skip wasn't creative. It was corporate. The show needed to sync its timeline with The Walking Dead so they could bring Morgan Jones over as a crossover character. That's it. The entire unique identity of Fear the Walking Dead was sacrificed so a guy from the parent show could walk from Virginia to Texas. But the real tragedy is what we lost. Original showrunner Dave Erickson had a documented 7-season plan for the series. Madison Clark, the show's protagonist, was supposed to slowly become a Negan-like villain over the course of the full run. A mother who starts out protecting her family and gradually becomes the monster. That's a genuinely compelling arc. That's the kind of slow-burn character tragedy that wins awards and builds legacy audiences. Instead, Erickson left the show after season 3, and his entire vision left with him. The 7-season plan, the villain Madison arc, the detailed exploration of society's collapse, all of it gone. A show literally called Fear the Walking Dead chose to skip the part where people first had reason to be afraid, which is, not ideal. But if you think skipping the best part of the story was bad, wait until you see what they replaced it with. The season 4 soft reboot. Here's where the show didn't just stumble. It performed a full identity transplant and hoped nobody would notice. When season 4 premiered in April 2018, Fear the Walking Dead was, on paper, the same show, same title, same network, same Sunday night slot. But behind the scenes, literally, everything had changed. Scott M. Gimple, the executive producer who'd been steering The Walking Dead during its own controversial decline, was now overseeing Fear. Original showrunner Dave Erickson was gone. In his place, Ian Goldberg and Andrew Chambliss arrived with a mandate to rebuild from the ground up. New creative direction, new cast members, new visual style, new storytelling structure, even a brand new opening credits sequence, which honestly told you everything you needed to know. This wasn't a creative evolution. This was a ground-up reconstruction wearing the same title like a skinsuit. And the first thing the new regime had to deal with was a problem they didn't even create. Frank Delane, the actor behind Nick Clark, had already requested his exit before Goldberg and Chambliss even showed up for work. So one of the most central characters in the entire series, the guy who'd been there since the pilot, got killed off in episode 3 by a child with a gun, 3 episodes into the new era, and the show had already lost a foundational pillar. Great start. But here's the kicker. 5 episodes later, in the mid-season finale, they killed Madison Clark too, the emotional anchor, the character the entire first 3 seasons had been built around, gone. Within 8 episodes of the new showrunners taking over, 2/3 of the Clark family had been erased from the board. Now, did the audience notice? Season 4 opened to roughly 3 million viewers for its first 5 episodes. People were curious about Morgan's crossover, the new direction, all of it. By the end of season 4, that number had dropped by about 50%. By the end of season 5, it dropped another 50%. That's a cumulative loss of approximately 75% of the audience in 2 seasons. 3 out of every 4 viewers looked at what the show had become and simply walked away. The reboot didn't just change Fear the Walking Dead. It systematically dismantled every element that made it its own thing and replaced it with a watered-down version of the parent show. The numbers don't lie. The gamble failed catastrophically, but the raw viewership collapse only tells half the story, because what those numbers really reflect is the destruction of something specific, something the show spent 3 seasons carefully building: the Clark family dynamic. Here's the thing about Fear the Walking Dead that people forget. The show wasn't a zombie survival series. It was a family drama that happened to have zombies in it. That was the entire pitch. A guidance counselor and an English teacher trying to hold their kids together while the world falls apart. Madison, Travis, Nick, Alicia, that was the show. The Clarks. And for 3 seasons, it worked. Madison was the ruthless pragmatist who'd do anything to protect her family. Travis was the moral compass trying to hold on to his humanity. Nick was the addict who was weirdly more comfortable in the apocalypse than he ever was in normal life. And Alicia was the one who kept getting overlooked, despite being the most competent person in the room. Their dysfunction, their loyalty, their constant tension between doing what's right and doing what keeps your family alive, that was the engine driving everything forward. Then season 4 happened, and somebody decided the engine needed to be ripped out and thrown into a ditch. Travis was already gone. He took a bullet in the season 3 premiere and died in a helicopter, which was devastating, but at least felt earned. His slow descent from pacifist teacher to someone capable of beating 2 men to death with his bare hands was genuinely compelling television. Losing him hurt, but the show still had Madison, Nick, and Alicia. They could carry it, except they couldn't, because the show wouldn't let them. Nick died in episode 3 of season 4, shot by a child. 3 episodes into a new season with new showrunners, and one of the original 4 pillars was gone. Then Madison burned herself alive in episode 8, sacrificing herself at the stadium. That's 2/3 of the remaining Clark family eliminated within 8 episodes. 3 seasons of investment in these characters characters in the specific ways they loved and failed each other, incinerated in less than half a season. The show spent roughly 40 episodes building the Clark family as its emotional foundation. Then, it took 8 episodes to demolish it completely. That's not character development. That's demolition. And once the family was gone, what was left? Alicia and Strand, 2 people. Everyone else was either new or imported from The Walking Dead. The show's entire reason for existing, the thing that made it structurally different from its parent series, had been amputated. What remained was just another group of strangers surviving together, which is, literally just The Walking Dead with a different title card. The show didn't outgrow the Clarks. It killed them off and had absolutely nothing to replace them with. You can't remove the spine from a body and expect it to keep standing, but if losing the family was bad, what they did to Madison specifically was somehow even worse. The Madison Clark erasure? Here's a fun exercise in how to ruin a character twice. Madison Clark died in Season 4, Episode 8, No One's Gone. She lured a horde of walkers into the stadium and lit them up, sacrificing herself so her kids could escape. It was devastating. It was final. And it gutted the show in ways the writers clearly didn't anticipate. But here's the thing. She wasn't actually dead. For over 3 real-world years spanning Seasons 4 through 7, Madison Clark was gone, absent, written out. The show restructured itself entirely around her absence. Characters grieved her. Alicia's entire arc became about processing the loss of her mother. Viewers moved on. The show moved on. And then, in the Season 7 finale, surprise. Madison's alive. Turns out she hid inside a water truck tank during the stadium fire, which is, not ideal as a dramatic reveal when you've spent 3 seasons treating her death as the emotional bedrock of every character decision on the show. Let me explain why this is a lose-lose situation. Madison's death broke Fear the Walking Dead. She was the protagonist. She was the anchor. Removing her left a vacuum that Morgan Jones and a rotating cast of underdeveloped villains couldn't fill. Fans knew it too. The hashtag Bring Back Madison campaigns ran for years. People genuinely believed that if the show just brought her back, everything would be fixed. Turns out, no. Season 8 revealed that Madison had been working for Padre as a collector, which is a polite way of saying she'd been kidnapping children and resettling them into a militarized island community. Kim Dickens herself described the returning version as Madison 2.0, a colder, more ruthless character. So the Madison fans spent 3 years demanding back wasn't even the same person anymore. Great, add that to the list. And co-showrunner Ian Goldberg told Insider they would answer how she survived the stadium, treating the resurrection like it was the big question audiences needed resolved. But that was never the question. Nobody was losing sleep over the mechanics of a water truck. The actual question was whether bringing her back was narratively earned after 3 entire seasons built on the assumption she was dead. Nobody bothered to answer that one. Here's where it gets complicated. Her absence destroyed the show's emotional core, but her return retroactively cheapened everything that happened while she was gone. Every grief scene, every character motivation rooted in losing Madison, every decision Alicia made because her mother was dead, all of it became hollow the moment Madison walked back on screen. 3 seasons of storytelling didn't just lose their protagonist. They lost their meaning. The tragedy is that fans were right to want her back and wrong to think it would help. Too much damage had been done. The show had already rebuilt itself poorly around a Madison-shaped hole. Filling that hole 3 years later with a different version of the character didn't repair anything. It just reminded everyone of what they'd lost. But if Madison's treatment feels like a writing paradox, wait until you meet the character who turned contradicting himself into an entire personality. And the show actually admitted it. The Morgan Jones paradox. Morgan Jones is not a character. He's a mood ring with a stick. And I don't mean that as some throwaway insult. The show literally had Morgan admit he's been 16 different somebodies since it all ended. That's not character development. That's the writers accidentally publishing their most honest self-review in Walking Dead history. A line meant to sound deep and introspective that instead reads like a confession. Hey, we know we've been making this up as we go. Please don't be mad. Here's the thing. Morgan arrives in Fear Season 4, Episode 1, fresh off The Walking Dead, and he immediately becomes the center of gravity. Not Alicia, not Strand, not any of the characters you'd spent 3 seasons investing in. Morgan, a guy from a completely different show, walks in and the camera basically says, "Okay, everyone, new main character just dropped. Lenny James is a fantastic actor. Nobody's arguing that." But the writing gave him nothing consistent to work with. From Season 4 through Season 5, Morgan clings to his pacifist philosophy like it's a life raft. All life is precious. No killing. He's basically a Zen monk wandering through Texas, trying to hand out protein bars and good vibes. 2 entire seasons of preaching nonviolence to people who are actively being shot at. Then Season 6 rolls around and he beheads a bounty hunter, just casually decapitates a man and tells Virginia, Morgan Jones is dead. You're dealing with somebody else now. Cool line, I guess, if you ignore the fact that we've watched this exact transformation happen before. On the other show, multiple times. Morgan goes, peaceful, something bad happens, Morgan goes feral. Someone talks him down, Morgan goes peaceful again. It's not an arc, it's a washing machine cycle. Across both shows, Morgan has ping-ponged between pacifist and savage killer roughly 5 times. Each transformation is treated like this massive emotional turning point, complete with dramatic music and long stares into the middle distance. But none of them stick, because the next season just resets him to whatever the plot needs. He's not a person with consistent psychology, he's a franchise chess piece getting moved to whichever square the writers need, filled that week. The 16 different somebody's line from season 6. Episode 3 is comedy gold because it's supposed to be this vulnerable moment of self-reflection. But all it actually does is highlight that the writers have changed his core identity so many times that even the character can't keep track. When your protagonist has to explain away his own inconsistency in dialogue, you haven't written a complex character, you've written a problem and taped a bandage over it on camera. Fans saw through it immediately. Morgan wasn't complex. He was muddled. A character given contradictory motivations season after season, then handed a single line of dialogue to retroactively frame all that chaos as intentional depth. It wasn't depth. It was a character who got passed between writing rooms like a library book nobody bothered to read the previous chapters of. But if Morgan's identity crisis is bad, wait until you meet the villain who made season 4's back half almost unwatchable, the filthy woman. Let's talk about Martha. Her husband Hank died in a car accident right at the start of the outbreak. Nobody stopped to help, and from that single event, Martha concluded that helping people makes them weak, and that she needed to kill anyone who offered assistance to others. That's her entire motivation. That's the whole thing. Her master plan involved finding water bottles that people had left out for strangers, carefully opening each one, poisoning it with antifreeze, and then resealing it so it looked untouched, one bottle at a time, individually, by hand. This is a villain operating at the logistical scale of someone tampering with Halloween candy. She's not a warlord. She's a woman with a grudge and a bottle of antifreeze wandering around Texas hoping someone gets thirsty at exactly the right location, which is, not ideal for a season antagonist. But here's the thing. Martha isn't the real problem. She's just the most obvious symptom. Because Fear the Walking Dead went through villains the way a toddler goes through crayons, breaking every single one before moving on to the next. The Vultures showed up in season 4's first half looking genuinely threatening. A group that just waits outside your walls until you run out of supplies? That's actually a compelling concept. But the show defeated them almost entirely off screen, rushing through their arc so fast you'd miss it if you blink. All that buildup gone, then came Virginia and the Pioneers, who somehow stretched across roughly 20 episodes spanning seasons 5 and 6 without ever developing a motivation beyond I want to control things because I like controlling things. The governor had Woodbury and a desperate need to project normalcy over his own psychosis. Negan had an entire philosophy about civilization through fear. Virginia had a cowboy hat and vague organizational skills. But if you think a generic dictator is where the escalation stops, absolutely not. Teddy Maddox and his doomsday cult launched 10 nuclear warheads in the season 6 finale. The show went from a woman poisoning water bottles to actual nuclear annihilation in roughly 2 seasons. That's not raising stakes. That's narrative panic. It's a writer's room slamming the bigger button over and over because they never figured out how to make anything feel genuinely threatening at a human level. And then, they turned Victor Strand into a villain. Strand, a character people had watched for 7 seasons, suddenly decided he was going to be a tower-dwelling dictator in the nuclear wasteland. His transformation felt less like character development and more like the show running out of new people to make evil. We need a bad guy. What about Strand? He's been here since the pilot. Yeah, but what if he was mean now? Sold. The parent show understood something. Fear never did. The governor worked because he was a dark mirror of Rick. Negan worked because he forced the audience to question whether Rick's group were really the good guys. Every great Walking Dead villain represented an ideological challenge. Fear's villains represented whatever the writers thought would fill 16 episodes. From bottle poisoner to nuclear cult leader to your own friend just being kind of rude now, it's a show fundamentally incapable of creating opposition that means anything. But if the villains were bad, wait until you see what the show did with the nuclear wasteland they created, because the logic gets so much worse. Nuclear wasteland logic. 10 nuclear warheads detonated across Texas. 10. That's not a plot point. That's an extinction-level event layered on top of an already existing extinction-level event. And the showrunners knew exactly what they had. They went on record promising this would very much change the fabric of the show. Radioactive walkers would represent a new, unknown quantity level of threat. The entire landscape of Fear the Walking Dead was supposed to transform into something we'd never seen before in this franchise. And for about 2 episodes, it almost worked. The irradiated wasteland looked different. The walkers looked different, with their appearance varying based on how close they'd been to the blast sites and whether they were alive or dead when the bombs hit. That's actually a cool detail. That's the kind of world building that makes you lean forward. But here's where it falls apart. The show introduced nuclear radiation as a constant environmental threat and then immediately forgot how radiation works. Not took creative liberties. Forgot. Characters would walk through zones that should have killed them in minutes and come out the other side with nothing worse than a cough. Other characters would get sick from brief exposure in areas that seemed comparatively mild. The rules changed every single episode based on whatever the script needed to happen next. And then there's Alicia Clark. The show had already established that radiation exposure was fatal. Other survivors got sick and died. That was the rule. That was the consequence the show itself created. So when Alicia contracts radiation poisoning, you'd expect the show to follow its own logic. Turns out, no. Alicia survived. No meaningful explanation. No secret cure. No genetic anomaly. She just didn't die because she was Alicia Clark, and the plot needed her breathing. Which is, not ideal when your entire season is built around the premise that radiation is dangerous. The broader problem is even worse than any individual inconsistency. A nuclear apocalypse on top of a zombie apocalypse should have been the most dramatic escalation in Walking Dead history. It should have fundamentally changed how characters survive, how they travel, what they eat, where they sleep. Every single decision should have been filtered through the reality of living in an irradiated wasteland. Instead, our characters navigated the nuclear hellscape using basically the same survival strategies they'd been using for 6 seasons. Find shelter, avoid walkers, talk about feelings, repeat. The nukes became set dressing, a color filter. The sky looked a little more orange, the walkers looked a little more crispy, and absolutely nothing of substance changed about how the show operated. You could remove the nuclear element entirely from season 7, and the character arcs would play out almost identically. That's not a world-altering event. That's a screensaver. This is the moment Fear the Walking Dead stopped even pretending its world had rules. When your show can detonate 10 nuclear warheads and have it matter less than a bad thunderstorm, you've lost the audience's trust in your storytelling. Every threat from this point forward carries zero weight because the viewer knows, with absolute certainty, that consequences are optional. The bombs went off and nothing changed. Great, add that to the list, but if you think a nuclear apocalypse with no consequences was bad, wait until you see what they did with Padre. The Padre letdown. Padre was supposed to save this show. It was teased throughout season 7 as this massive mystery, this place that could mean safety or salvation or something worth caring about. Characters whispered about it like it was the promised land, and when season 8 finally premiered on May 14th, 2023, we got our answer. Padre was an old island fortress run by people who thought stealing children and raising them as soldiers was a reasonable community model. Cool, add that to the list. And Madison Clark, the character fans had spent years campaigning to bring back, was working for it as a collector, kidnapping children from their parents and delivering them to Padre like some kind of post-apocalyptic child services agent with zero oversight. Let that sink in for a sec. The show's original protagonist, the woman whose apparent death broke the fan base, was brought back from the dead just to serve as muscle for yet another authoritarian organization. We'd already done this. Virginia and the Pioneers, Strand's Tower, Teddy's Cult. The show had exactly one villain template, and it used it until the template disintegrated into a fine powder and blew away in the wind. But here's where it gets genuinely embarrassing. June's storyline in season 8 was Madison's storyline. Both were loners working for Padre. Both turned against it to protect children. Both had supporting characters who stayed loyal to Padre because they were protecting their own families. The writers didn't just run out of ideas. They copy-pasted a character arc within the same season and hoped nobody would notice. You could literally swap the character names in the scripts, and the episodes would still function. I don't know what to tell you. The anthology format made everything worse. When season 6 introduced it, the structure felt fresh. Focused episodes, tight character work, real tension. Individual hours that could stand on their own while still feeding into a larger narrative. By season 8, it had been done to death beyond resuscitation. Main characters would vanish for weeks at a time with zero explanation. Every episode needed 5 minutes of exposition just to remind you where everyone was and what they were doing. The momentum didn't stall. It evaporated. You'd finish an episode genuinely invested in a storyline, and then the show would just abandon it for 3 weeks to follow someone you barely remembered existed. And that's the thing about this final season. It wasn't just one more bad year of television. It was the cumulative weight of every single failure we've talked about. The skip transition meant there was no foundation. The reboot killed the family. The villains never landed. The logic collapsed under nuclear warheads that nobody understood. Padre was the last chance to course correct, and instead the show recycled the same beats it had already exhausted 3 times over. At a certain point, you have to wonder if anyone in the writers' room was actually watching their own show. Fear the Walking Dead ran ran for 113 episodes across 8 seasons. It premiered as a show about a family watching civilization crumble around them, something genuinely different from its parent series. It ended on November 19, 2023, not with a dramatic conclusion, but with a creative whimper. The cast had been gutted. The identity had been erased. The goodwill had been burned through so thoroughly that the finale barely registered as an event. Most fans had already stopped watching. The ones who stuck around did so out of obligation, not excitement. This was a show about the fall of civilization that itself fell apart in slow motion. Not all stories have a point. Sometimes they're just sad and disappointing from beginning to end. If you enjoyed this video and want to see every zombie virus type explained, click the video on the screen now.